Hi everyone and welcome to our new webinar. I'm Marina from Acceleratio and today with me are our special guests Serge and Isabel. So this webinar is sponsored by our well-known SharePoint administration tool SPDocket and our new SQL Server administration tool SQL Docket. So I'm sure you'll enjoy the session. Thank you again for joining us. Of course, feel free to write questions in the question panel at your right, and we will try to answer all your questions. We will leave about 10 minutes for answering, and don't worry, because if we don't answer all your questions, you will receive the answers via email. So enjoy the session, and Serge and Isabel, you can take it over now.
Okay, thank you, Marina.
Thank you.
So, welcome to this webinar. The title of the webinar is pretty long. It's Unbreakable SharePoint 2016 with SQL Server 2016, always on availability groups. So, I hope that everybody can hear and see my screen. First off, I would like to thank Acceleratio for organizing this webinar. You know their product, they're very famous, SQL Docket and SPDocket, so if you work on-prem, you really need them. So actually we use them.
Yeah.
So I'm Sergio Luca, I'm Office Server and Service MVP based in Brussels. I've been working with SharePoint almost since the beginning of the product, and I'm both an IT pro and a dev. And next to me is Isabel. Hello, Isabel.
Hello, so I'm Isabel van Kampenhout and I'm also from Brussels. I'm a data platform MVP and I'm working with SQL Server for a very, very long time, actually.
Okay, thank you, Isabel. Okay, so quick overview of the menu of the day. So first, I hope that you will understand our French English. So we are broadcasting this from Brussels, from our office in Brussels. So quick overview of the menu, so quick overview of the business continuity concept. Then we'll get deeper and deeper into the technology. So SharePoint 2016 architecture related to business continuity. Then deeper and deeper into the business continuity. And SharePoint 2016 and always on availability group. So we'll see what it is and how that works, how to set that up. And then conclusion. And of course, we will show you a lot of demos and live demos. Let's start from the beginning, big picture on business continuity. So business continuity is not just about technology, but it's also a set of management practices. And the idea is, of course, to focus first on the business. Don't reinvent the wheel, so you can download very nice white paper on business continuity, like the ISO 22301. So you can download that from here. It's a very interesting document. And when it comes to IT role, so IT role in business continuity is the following. First, IT must prevent incident by providing a proactive monitoring, and you need, of course, good monitoring tools, and there are many things you can do. So even check, for instance, the database consistency. So there are many utilities to do that. But also in terms of staff organization, so you need a good staff, well trained, and of course the staff need to be ready when an incident happens. And you know that sometimes incidents happen, and when the incident happens, then you need to be happy to have a good architecture that provides both HA, so high availability, and DR, disaster recovery. So of course we will explain this concept. You need to be very familiar with the following terminology. So SLA, service level agreement, HA, high availability, DR, disaster recovery, RPO, recovery point objective, and RTO, recovery time objective. So this slide comes from Microsoft. Recovery point objective. So if you want to talk about business continuity with the business, these 2 points are really key. So RPO and RTO. And the first one could be a problem because recovery point objective means how much data can you afford to lose. you might lose data between the time that then you take a backup and when the incident happened. This could happen. You cannot take backup all the time. So the business is not always aware that, well, actually you might lose data. Okay? So be ready to talk about this with the business. That's not easy. The second concept is easier to handle. It's recovery time objective, means how long can you afford to wait? So if, for instance, your SharePoint farm crash, you might have, for instance, 1 hour. So 1 hour to recover. So, for example, you can have an RPO of 3 hours, and RTO 1 hour means you can lose maximum 3 hours of data, but you can only wait 1 hour before your service is back. And things can be more complicated because, you know, in a SharePoint farm, you may have different services, and the different services may have different recovery point objective and even different recovery time objective. So this picture illustrates that. For instance, here you take your backup or your log backup at this time here, an incident happened, so you have a crash, and the RPO is, the maximum RPO is the data you might lose between the backup and the incident, of course. And it may take time to recover, so that's the RTO. Easy. So, you know, most people know the concept of SLA, service level agreements, that can be declined in RTO and RPO. You know that in terms of availability, Microsoft achieved at least 3.9, so 99.9% of availability. That's contracted. But most of the time with Office 365, they achieve 4.9. So they guarantee 3.9, but they can achieve 4.9. So on-prem, we achieve 4.9. It's not complicated to achieve 4.9. Just one thing is, all the technology we are going to cover in this webinar are technologies that we have been practicing for years. So we are very happy to share this experience here. And of course, RPO, RTO, so the SLA, well, you need to find a balance between RPO, RTO on one side and cost on the other side. So achieving a high level of SLA can be very expensive, and it's not always necessary. That's why you need to have a good discussion with the business, and believe me, that's not always easy. It's more an art than a science. Huh, Isabel?
That's true.
Yeah. So this slide illustrates the difference between HA, high availability, and DR, disaster recovery. So in the time, you may experiment different issues. Example, you need to patch your SharePoint farm or your SQL server. That's HA. You might lose a hard drive. That's HA. You might lose your power supply. That's HA. And for instance, a bump hit the building, or the building gets flooded, or something else. Your business can close, so you need to recover. And that's a typical DR situation.
Even data corruption can lead to a DR situation.
Exactly. The difference between HA and DR is not always easy to distinguish, because indeed data corruption can mean that you have to wait a lot to recover. You need to find all the backup and rebuild the databases. Mm-hmm. It can take time, or even, example, your farm is corrupted or your farm crashed, and it takes time to recover. I mean, it can take time before you pinpoint the issue. So an HA could be a DR, yes. Okay, now it's not just technology, but let's get deeper into what we love, which is architecture, SharePoint 2013 and 2016 architecture, just specifically for disaster, for business continuity. And what is very important is to keep in mind the big picture. You have a SharePoint farm, but most of the time your SharePoint farm is not alone. So indeed, the SharePoint farm has a lot of databases, and here in this session, we will focus on the data layer, because the data layer, of course, play a crucial role in business continuity. But next to the SharePoint farm, you might have an Office Online Server farm or OA, Office Web App farm. So this also might need to be business continuity compliant. And also, you might have a Workflow Manager farm. Okay, so this also need to be managed in terms of business continuity, and Workflow Manager is another beat, right? Most of my customers don't use Workflow Manager. They use workflow solution like Nintex, so they use the workflow engine running in the SharePoint farm, but some use Workflow Manager as well. And also, don't forget the custom code, so the apps and the add-in. So don't forget them. They might also need to be business continuity compliant. Okay, there is a missing point in this picture, Isabel, which is the Identity Manager. So you might also use the Microsoft Identity Manager, which is interesting in SharePoint 2016. So this also needs to be taken into account. Okay. Now, regarding the data layer, again, we will focus more on the data layer here. You can classify the SharePoint databases in 3 categories. So we have 3 colors here. The first category of databases here in blue are what I used to call the farm-specific databases. So that means the configuration database, the central administration database, the state, and the usage database. Okay, so you have one configuration database per farm, one central administration database per farm, etc. So that's farm specific. Of course, your site collection content, so your document, etc., your SharePoint list content is stored in the content database. And next to that, you have the service application database, like the user profile, the BDC, the managed metadata, the search, the store, secure store, and so on. And actually, you need to make a distinction between these 3 categories of database because, as you will see later, they will be grouped in 3 containers that we will call the availability groups. I will give you more details about that later, but that's important to pinpoint that at the moment, right? It's not just for the show. Okay, so now what about SharePoint and business continuity? As I told you before, difference between HA and DR, disaster recovery, is not always easy to distinguish. Example, so let's take the case of patching, for instance. So patching is a typically HA situation. So in SharePoint 2013, you might experiment downtime. So even if your farm is redundant, so if you duplicate all the SharePoint server, you might get downtime. You will have downtime. But in SharePoint 2016, we have the zero downtime patching, right? So if your farm is redundant, you get zero downtime patching. However, in the real world, the patching is risky. So in HA situation, so the patching could become a DR because, well, you know, shit happen, right? So your farm could be broken. So be ready for that. Also, deployment. So if you deploy server-side code, yeah, well, yes, your server-side code might corrupt your farm. This happens as well. So this could become a DR situation. And when it comes to stretch farm, so you know what a stretch farm is. So a stretch farm is a farm with a SharePoint server split it into closed data center. That was a very popular architecture in the past. So in the past, I mean before SharePoint 2013. But since SharePoint 2013, Microsoft required a very strict latency requirement. So, and that means, well, it's less popular because achieving the latency that Microsoft requires is sometimes complicated in the real world. So it's less popular, and moreover, a stretch farm is not a DR because in a stretch farm, for instance, you have one configuration database, and if the configuration database is corrupted, then you lose your farm. You know that you can take a backup of the configuration database, but you cannot do a restore. So restoring a configuration database is not supported. So that's one of the weaknesses of SharePoint, I would say, is the configuration database. And believe me or not, it happened to me a month ago. Right. So another typical DR situation, actually it's almost never happened. It's the building is destroyed. So this never happened in the real world. Okay, but okay, some people believe that. But the building could be flooded, the data center could be flooded, or your farm cannot recover. That's DR. Now, how can you achieve HA, high availability? First, you need server redundancy. And again, you can I recommend you to watch the previous webcast from Spence Arbor on SharePoint 2016 main role. So you can get server redundancy. Don't forget the big picture. It's not just SharePoint. It's also Office Web App or Office Online Server. It's also the workflow farm, and of course, SQL Server. And if you have server redundancy, then you can have services redundancy, because you can start the services on different server, of course, on different machines. Now, DR strategy. So what are the different options or the different case of disaster recovery? So there are actually three categories. We call that cold standby. That means recovery in hours or days. And usually this is based on backup and restore. We have the usual one, which is the warm standby, means it takes less time to recover, so minutes and hours. We usually call that warm standby. So it's also backup restore. And sometimes VM can already be ready. So you might have to reinstall SharePoint on this VM, but if you use PowerShell, then it can be fast. And that's what we're going to focus on in this webinar. It's hot standby. That means recovery in seconds or minutes. And basically, in the real world, to have a very efficient hot standby recovery, you will need two farms. And the technology to synchronize the two farms, so the data layer, will be either rock chipping, which is a SQL Server technology, or, and that's what we're going to illustrate here, always-on availability groups. So the demo will illustrate the hot standby here. Now, deeper and deeper, SharePoint and SQL Server always-on availability groups. Well, there are many HA and DR technology in SQL Server. So they are all illustrated in this rather complex slide. As you can see here, in the column here, we describe the RPO, potential data loss, the RTO, the potential RTO, recovery time, if the technology supports automatic failover, or if you need some manual intervention. And also here, if you can have secondaries, so additional data layer nodes. And as you can see here, we will focus on always-on availability groups, and you will see that there are two flavors of it, a synchronous commit. So we use that if the nodes, the data nodes, so the SQL Server nodes are in a very fast network, right? So they are very close. And asynchronous if the connection between your SQL Server is slow. It could be the internet. So here, in the case of synchronous, you can see that we have 0 data loss. Recovery RTO is seconds, so it takes seconds to switch from one node to the other node. And failover can be automatic, will be automatic. And we have up to 2 secondary nodes, so duplicates. In case of asynchronous, so between 2 SQL Server that are far, with a slow network between them, so RPO is second. So you might experiment data loss. So the latest transaction might be lost, right? But only the latest transaction. We'll get back to this. And the RTO in asynchronous can be minutes. In our demo, if we are lucky, it will take seconds, but okay. And in the case of asynchronous, we don't have automatic failover. You need a manual intervention. Or it could be a manual intervention to start a PowerShell script, but you still need some manual intervention. But here we can have more secondaries, so we can have up to 8 secondaries. Most of the time you don't need 8, but in most of cases it's 3 or 4. And also, this is not mentioned in this slide, is the secondary nodes can be used in read-only mode as well. So it's not just a node, it's the SQL Server that can be used in read-only mode, and you will see that it can be interesting. You can do backup from these nodes or something else. Okay. So this slide illustrates the HA first. So later on I will illustrate the DR, but let's focus on the HA and SharePoint. So we have a farm 1, which is our main farm. And of course, this farm can have many SharePoint servers. It's based in Geneva. That's a real case. And here we have two SQL Server nodes, SQL 1, SQL 2. They are connected with the cluster. Isabel will explain the cluster, and they are in availability groups, but let's focus on the big picture. As you can see here, the data is synchronously synchronized between the two data nodes. So any transaction you put in SQL 1, which is the main node, so the farm is connected to SQL 1 via an alias, any connection here is automatically committed in SQL 2. That's guaranteed. So you don't lose data, right? And in case of crash of SQL Server, but we all know that SQL Server never crash, Isabel, right? No.
Absolutely.
To be honest, SQL Server is probably the most robust part of a SharePoint farm. But you want to patch your SQL Server. That's the most common situation. No? You need to patch it. Then you can switch to SQL 2, or in case of crash, the system will automatically switch to SQL 2. Okay? And user won't notice. I will illustrate that in the demo. I hope that it will work, because it's a lab, it's not a production farm. But anyway, okay, that's HA. And in terms of databases, it's actually very easy to set up, as long as you know how to set up availability groups. But the database that need to be synchronized are the following. Basically, all the SharePoint database can be synchronized across the sync node. Okay, so the farm-specific database, of course, the content database, and the service application databases. Maybe the usage is a different bit because you have a lot of traffic in the usage database, so it might not be interesting to synchronize the usage database, but still you need at least two usage database in the two nodes, the two SQL Server nodes.
To keep your log clean.
To keep your log clean. Otherwise, your farm will work, but you get a lot of error in the ULS. Okay, so that's still HA. Now, how can you set up an HA farm in Geneva, so the main farm in this case? Well, what we recommend is, as usual, is keep it simple. Install a farm as a normal SharePoint farm. There's only one thing. So install the farm in, so Vienna is Geneva here, sorry, we travel a bit too much. It's Geneva. And the thing is, you need to define, and that's a recommendation, I won't call that a best practice, but we recommend that, is to define 3 aliases. You know that when you install SharePoint, connection between SharePoint and SQL, well, good practice is to define an alias. But here we recommend 3 aliases. So basically, if you want to use always on availability groups with SharePoint 2013, you need Service Pack 1 and this cumulative update, right? That's for 13. And SharePoint 2016 can right away use the availability groups. But 3 aliases. Why 3 aliases? Well, one for the content databases, one alias for the service databases, and one for the farm-specific database. I mean, by farm, I mean the central administration database, the configuration and the state, and well, maybe not the usage. Okay, so you install your farm, just 3 aliases, and then test your farm, make sure it works correctly. Well, just one thing, in PowerShell, because we all use PowerShell, when you install your farm, you should have something like this. So define your configuration database name, of course, then define 3 aliases, and for instance here, my alias 1 is listener 1, alias 2 listener 2, alias 3 listener 3. You will see why I call them listener. But in the first place, all these aliases will point to the first SQL node. So it's a normal SharePoint installation that point to one node, okay? Nothing specific. And then of course, when you create the farm, so you create the configuration database, you can specify in the database server alias 1 for the farm. That's important. When you create the content database, so here you create the SP web application, define the database, and here we can specify database server alias 2. For the services, like for instance the managed metadata service application, you're going to use alias 3. Okay? There is just one thing, which is the search. The search is a special bit. And I will get back to the search later, but here you can use alias 1 here for the search. I will explain why. Okay, then test your farm, make sure it works, it's a normal SharePoint farm, and then you have to prepare your SharePoint database to make them availability group compliant. And this means that the recovery mode of your SharePoint database must be set to full. Okay, I think by default configuration database is not full, it's simple, but all the SharePoint database must now switch to full. Otherwise, there cannot be sync between the nodes. And you must take a full backup of your SharePoint database, at least one. And since your recovery database, the recovery mode will be set to full, that means that you are going to take log backup. So you can take log backup. So you have logs, so your log will grow up, okay? And if you don't want your log to grow up too much, of course, at some point you need to take a log backup. Otherwise, you can block your database. Okay, so you will have to take a log backup. That's important. Okay, so far nothing special, right? But then, and the fun begins. Then you need to configure the SQL Server cluster. And that means, and Isabel will illustrate that, you have to create a Windows cluster, so Windows Cluster Service, and in this cluster you will have the different SQL node. In our case, in the demo, we have 3 nodes, so 2 nodes for the main farm, 1 for the DR farm. And so the cluster service is the glue between the different SQL Server nodes. You will have to create, and we'll illustrate that in the demo, 3 always-on availability groups, and you need to add the SharePoint database in these availability groups. You can do that with a wizard, or you can use PowerShell to do that. You have to create 3 listeners because SharePoint will connect to the SQL Server, to the database, via alias that will point to listeners. So listeners are special objects that will be managed by the cluster. So we have 1 listener per availability group. So in our demo we have 3 listeners, and which is a very common situation. And also, and I always forget this one, is that since you have several SQL Server nodes, your SharePoint login will have to be copied. So the SharePoint login and the SharePoint login permission will have to be copied on every SQL Server node. Okay? So you can do that manually, or we will show you a script that allows you to do that. Yes. So when the listener have been created, then you can change the alias. So the SQL Server alias. So you can point the alias, for instance, listener 1 will point to listener 1, so AVG1, availability group 1 listener, alias 2 to AVG2 listener, alias 3 to AVG3 listener. Right? So voila. And of course, PowerShell is your friend, everything can be scripted. We won't show too much PowerShell here because we also want to focus on the concept, but if you want, we can share the PowerShell. Okay. That was HA, but we did prepare the fan from DR. Now let's focus on the big picture. DR, SharePoint, and always-on availability group. So in this case, we want to quickly recover, so we want a hot standby. And so in case of trouble in our main farm in Geneva, we want to be able to quickly switch, so in terms of seconds, to our secondary farm, the DR farm in Brussels. So here again, if you remember, in Geneva, we have 2 SQL nodes, so and the database are synchronized between SQL 1 and SQL 2. For instance, here, let's say that SQL 1 is the primary node, okay? In case of trouble in Geneva, I won't say that there is a bomb in the building, but the building might be destroyed or something else, or your farm crashed, you cannot recover it on time, you cannot achieve your SLA, contractual SLA, you can switch to Brussels, okay? And then you need to, of course, to fix your farm, your main farm in Geneva, and then you can switch back to Geneva. So that's what we're going to illustrate in the demo as well. In terms of databases, how does that work? Of course, if you remember, this is the farm in Geneva, this is the farm in Brussels, the DR farm. In Geneva, we have HA, that means, if you remember, all the databases, or the SharePoint database, maybe with an exception, which is the usage database, can be synchronously synchronized. And we will show you how to achieve that. But between Geneva and Brussels, the DR, only these databases can be synchronized. Well, you don't need to synchronize the farm-specific database because we have another farm. Okay, so we have a configuration for Brussels, specific configuration database, central administration, state and usage right here. So these cannot be synchronized from the one in Geneva. But of course, the content databases will have to be synchronized asynchronously because the network can be slow, and the services databases, with one exception, or maybe two, but one very important is the search. You cannot synchronize the search databases between the main farm and the DR farm. And because well, let's be honest, the search in SharePoint is not DR compliant. I know some people won't be very happy when I say that, but that's true, it's not DR compliant. We have different strategy to achieve DR with the search, and we'll talk about that.
I think that in Office 365, the SLA for the search is also different.
Well, it's not guaranteed for the search. It can take a week, up to a week, to rebuild the search in Office 365, but it's not contractually for the search, if I remember well. And this is documentation coming from the TechNet. This one is very important. You can see async commit, so between the main farm and the DR. What is not supported is administration, configuration doesn't make sense because it's specific to the farm. Here we have two farms. The BI stuff, well, actually, yes, performance one, yes, but Power Pivot not, because it's not necessary, because Power Pivot is a stateless system, so you can install Power Pivot on the other farm. Search cannot be synchronized between the two farms. State service does not make sense because it's another farm. And also UPA sync. So if you use the user profile synchronization, so if user need to be able to write back to Active Directory when they change the user profile, then UPA, well, it cannot be synchronized. But we have another way to handle this. Or in case of SharePoint 2016, you don't use the UPA sync, but you use the Microsoft Identity Manager. And we'll talk about the DR and MIM later. Okay, so now our farm in Geneva has been set up. We have a cluster. How can we set up the farm in Brussels, the DR farm? Well, usually, it depends. For most of my customers, the DR farm is a small farm. But in some customer, it should be exactly the same. And some customer, for instance, the financial customer, like banks, they have a policy, and the policy is every 2 months they switch from the main farm to the DR farm. So there's no second-class citizen. Okay, so it all depends on the customer. But the idea is you can install the SharePoint farm in Brussels, same bytes, constraint, and you have to test. Okay, if the farm in Brussels is a small farm, you don't have to point the SharePoint farm to the listeners. You can directly communicate via the alias, of course, to the SQL server. Okay. However, if your farm, the DR farm, need also HA, then you might have redundancy of SQL server in the DR farm, and then of course you need to use listeners as well. But test is very important as usual, of course. Of course, your PowerShell is your friend. Okay, so now let's get in the plumbing, and then Isabel will give you more detailed information about how to do that. So how can you install the availability group? So first you need to install you have to prepare the cluster, and what we recommend is to predefine the cluster object. So you need to create a CNO, a computer name object, which will take the name of your cluster in Active Directory, and you have to do that in a specific OU, organization unit. Then you are going to use an account to create a cluster, and this account needs the specific permission to create a cluster. And also, you need to grant the CNO, computer name object permission, to the OU, organization unit. Then you can install the cluster service. So you can install the cluster service. You have to do that on every SQL Server node. That's the glue between your SQL Server. You add the nodes in the cluster, you configure the quorum, and Isabel will show you that. And then, when it's ready, you have to create the 3 availability groups in SQL Server. You can do that by using PowerShell or by using SQL Server Management Studio. You create the listener. Don't forget to change the alias. They should point to the listeners. And you can add the database into the availability groups by using PowerShell, by using the wizard. Regarding PowerShell, to do that, we have PowerShell command for SharePoint, PowerShell command for SQL Server. Well, there are more PowerShell commands when it comes to availability group in the SQL Server. So usually we use the SQL Server PowerShell. But I think with the setup account, you can use the SharePoint PowerShell as well to add a database in availability groups. Okay, we have a demo now. Isabel will illustrate that. Just before the demo, I would like to give you a quick overview of the environment or lab environment. So all our SharePoint machines, so we have 2 farms running in Azure. As you will see, we have 3 SQL Server here, SQL 1, SQL 2, that's for the main farm. Let's call that the Geneva farm, and 3 for Brussels. And then in Geneva, we have a mineral farm with the search here. Screen is a little bit small. A distributed cache, which is running. An app server. Yeah, I've turned off the Office Online server. And of course, one web frontend here. Okay, that's for the farm in Geneva. And Brussels, the DR, we have SQL 03. And only one SharePoint machine, which is this one, SP16 farm DR. Just quick overview. I mean, don't forget it. Don't remember this. But okay. Now, Isabel, it's up to you. Okay. The cluster.
Okay, thank you, Serge. So, as the DBA, I do the plumbing part of the scenario.
Yeah, so I do the sexy part. You do the plumbing part, right?
Absolutely. So, actually, I will go to one of the SQL Server, the first one. And first of all, we will go to the failover cluster manager. Okay. So you can see here the cluster itself. So the cluster name here, SP16 SQL class. That's the computer name object that you can find in the Active Directory. And we have created this cluster on top of our 3 nodes. So the 3 nodes are the 3 SQL Server. The 01 and the 02 are local, and the 03 is the remote one in our scenario. And you can also notice that this node doesn't have any votes. So that means that the cluster can never choose himself to go to this server. Another important point, if you go to the storage, if you are accustomed to use Windows cluster, maybe you think that you will find some shared storage. There is none. So there is no shared storage here between our server. The Windows cluster will be used only to manage one kind of resource. I will go back to this later on.
So no single point of failure when it comes to data, right?
Yes, absolutely. So each of the SQL Server is independent. Okay. That's very, very important. That means also that your data exist, in this case, 3 times. Yeah. For the capacity, it's important to know that.
And if it's corrupted 3 times. That's correct. Huh?
Yes.
That's why we need to take backup.
Corruption is always the R situation. Yeah, I've seen terrible situations, believe me.
Yeah, I believe you. I remember.
Okay. So at this point, once the cluster is created, we can now go to the SQL Configuration Manager. And this action needs to be done on all of the nodes, obviously. And we will go to the SQL Server Services property here. There is a dedicated tab called Always On High Availability. Once the SQL Server is part of the cluster, you will see here the name of the cluster itself, and you will have the possibility to enable the feature Always On Availability Group. Before that, you can't create availability groups inside of Management Studio. Once you have enabled this, you need to restart the service. And then we can now go to my favorite tool ever.
Yeah, your kitchen.
So don't say that. Don't say that.
Close this one? Maybe
yes,
this one?
I will close this one. Don't be nervous. I know what I am doing.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
So in this Management Studio, we can see all of our SQL Server here. And if we go to, sorry, my kitchen is not
Your kitchen is slow.
tidy, but okay. So you will see here the Always On High Availability folder, and then we will have all the availability group here. So we have 3 availability groups in this scenario, and the first one is called SharePoint AG, and in this availability groups we will find all the farm specific database, like the configuration database and the central admin database, but also the search database because of the specificity.
Yeah, I will get back to the search in detail.
Yeah, yes. So we will find the database, but we have also what we call the replica. So replica is the SQL name for nodes, actually.
Yeah.
Okay. And if I go to the property of my replica here, okay, you can see that the availability mode here is synchronous commit, meaning that all the transactions are committed together to our replica, meaning that they really need to be close together, otherwise you will have some latency in your farm. So that's very, very important. Okay, so this is the first availability group, and it is really dedicated to the farm itself.
Yeah, so we have a one that's for HA, huh? It's within the same farm.
Yes, it's within the same farm, absolutely. The second availability groups is here for the content database, and in this case it is split on top of 3 SQL server. So you will have the 0102 in Geneva, but also the remote one, so the 03 in Brussels in the scenario. And if I go to the property of the 03, I can see in this case that the availability mode is asynchronous. And asynchronous means that, okay, you will receive the data but not commit together. And this, yes, and this means that you can lose some data, and that's why you can't have any automatic failover to this node. And this is also the reason why you don't give any vote or decision power to this node in your architecture. That's very important. There are situations more critical. Okay, the third category of resource that we can see in this screen is the listener. So every groups a listener defined here, and if I go to the property, I can see the listener DNS name, so the alias waypoint on this name, and one or maybe 2 IP. Usually it's one, but you can work with more
each
than
availability group as a listener, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And the third availability group here is dedicated to all the services database.
Okay.
Okay. So we can now go back to the cluster manager, and where are, oh sorry, this one. Where are our availability groups, that's a terrible name.
Yeah, it's not easy.
Especially for French-speaking people like me, so sorry. So if I go to the roles here, I will see my availability groups. So once they are created. Very important for the management of your availability groups, you will see that Serge will use only the management studio. So it's very rare that we need to go to the Windows cluster itself. It's more for troubleshooting.
Yeah, the cluster event is a nice place as well. Huh?
Yes, cluster event. Yes,
nice
troubleshooting, like I say.
For monitoring.
Yeah. The only results monitored by the cluster is the listener itself. Okay, so there are non-disk shared, it's only the IP address. And that's really interesting. At the creation of the availability groups, the cluster service adds the listener to the Active Directory. That's why the cluster needs special permission in the Active Directory. Because at the moment you will run the wizard to create the listener, it is with the identity of the cluster that the listener will be created into the Active Directory and then published to the DNS.
Yeah. So also, if I can add something, last year I remember I faced a situation where the DNS used by my customer was not the Microsoft DNS, but they used another one. In this case, it was Infoblox. So it was not easy to get the listener created in the Infoblox. So we had to set some specific permission in Infoblox to make sure that the cluster object could create the listener in the DNS. But for most customers, they use the Microsoft DNS, which is linked to Active Directory.
Mm-hmm.
But this happened, huh? This happened.
Absolutely. So the listener, to remember, the listener is the key to follow very quickly between the nodes. Because the Windows cluster will be in charge to attribute this IP address to the right nodes without using the DNS. So your SharePoint farm must absolutely be connected through an alias connected to the listener. That's the good practice. Okay, so all is set up, but still, Serge mentioned it earlier in the session. The availability groups take care of the database and their content, but not of the object outside of the database, like the logins or like the jobs in SQL. Yeah. So we need to be sure that all our nodes are correctly synchronized for this object too.
The infamous SharePoint login, SharePoint farm, SharePoint setup account, service account.
You name it.
Yeah. Okay.
So to be sure that all of those objects exist on all of the replica, I usually use PowerShell script, and there is a really nice module called DBA Tools that you can find on the dbatools.io. It's free. It's a community project. You will have over 150 commands. And as you can see here, it is really, really simple and easy to copy your login, to copy your SQL job, and then you can schedule that to do that regularly if you have some new stuff coming. Speaking of new stuff.
Cherry on the cake.
Yeah. So speaking of new stuff, we know that SharePoint will create new databases.
SharePoint servers, yes, when they use the wizard, or even if they don't use the wizard.
Yes.
We can create content databases.
So there will be new database and maybe new service database, who knows?
Service database or content database, yes.
Okay. So
and we forget to mention that to the DBA.
So another challenge is, how can you automatically add the new database in the availability groups? Or automatically or without effort, I will say. So I also use PowerShell, of course, and my little trick here is that I tag all of the database with a kind of tattoo. So if I go back here to the management studio and I go to the database, I will show you what it is a tattoo for me.
You like tattoo. Show me your tattoo.
Shh. Be fair. I need to be focused here.
Yeah.
So if I go to the property of a database, I have the extended properties. And the extended property, they are custom property, metadata. Huh?
You know metadata.
Yes, yes. I'm using your language here. So, for instance, I'm using a RPO property for my backup, so my backup know, and I also have a AG, Ability Group property, where I can put the correct name for the ability groups. And then I can use a PowerShell script like this one when I will, for each database, have a look to the extended properties, and then have a look if the database is already in an ability groups, and then for the database who needs to be added, just run the script and it will do the job. That's very convenient. Yes. To be totally honest, because
always.
Yes, yes. I'm a control freak DBA. It's like a pleonasm, of course. I also have a daily script to detect all the database without any tattoo, without extended property. And so I'm notified if there are some wild SharePoint database coming into my server.
I see what you mean.
Yes, you see. Okay. So your playground is now ready for you, Serge?
Okay, so the cluster is running, hopefully.
Yeah.
Now we can move to next step. I know we are a little bit late, but according to Marina, we have more time, so that's good. And yes, so this slide illustrates tattoo, so thank you. I know you like tattoos.
Yes, that's the kind of DBA
This guy reminds me of someone. Okay. Oh, in the next demo, well, actually, I will group the next demo. I will illustrate the failover cluster and always on. And I will illustrate the high availability and disaster recovery in one shot. Okay. So let's go to the virtual machine, and I will go to my farm, my SharePoint farm. Okay. So this is my SharePoint farm in Geneva, the main farm. So in this case, it's a main role farm, whatever. So it's a SharePoint 2016 farm. And here, I've out-of-the-box team site, right? So this is my central administration in Geneva, right? And at the moment here, this farm is pointing to the primary node, which if I go to SQL Server, let's close this. The primary node is here, SQL 1. You see, SQL 1 is the primary node. Okay, so let's say
stop it.
I stop it, or the virtual machine crashed, but I still need it in the demo, so I won't crash it. I won't shut it down. But we stop the service. Normally, the system should automatically switch to SQL 02, and normally, well, it take a few seconds. Okay, so it's switching. That's HA, and normally user should not notice. Let's cross our finger, right? That's free.
Maybe you can show.
I can show, yes. Is this one the primary node now? Let's go. Yes, so it's primary. You see, for this database, the farm specific database, configuration database and so on, content database and service, it's not the primary node. Which means that normally if I get back to my SharePoint site, where's my virtual machine? Here, it should still be up and running. Yes. If I go to Central Administration, Geneva, it should be fine. Okay, so that works.
That works.
Okay, so no downtime.
No downtime.
Right.
Let's crash the second one.
Yeah.
I enjoy it.
Yes, yes, yes. Yeah, indeed. Well, we can. So let's say now, now we have two farms. The one in Geneva, the main farm, with its own central administration, of course, but we have the farm in Brussels. And let's refresh this. As you can see here, this one is read-only, because indeed in Brussels, the secondary nodes are in read mode. They're synchronized, but they are in read mode. And that's one of the benefits of availability groups. We can use the database in read-only. So you can check your database. You cannot change anything here, but you can check that out. And if I get back to Geneva, which is where people are working, if I delete this one, let's remove a document here in this document library, then normally in my remote farm, the DR farm, this document should disappear, and that works. Okay.
And for the services?
And for the services, if I go to the service application in Geneva, let's go to a term store. And here, this is my term store, and let's add a new, let's add something like, let's call that acceleration. Right? Now, if I go to my DR farm, you see, this is a DR central administration. I go to the term store, and normally, it's a bit slow in Brussels.
It's a little farm.
It's a small farm, yes, it's a small farm. Let's go, and we should see acceleration. That works. Okay, so that's fine. Now, there's something that you need to be aware of. Let's go back to Geneva. It's the search. The search is not DR compliant, by default at least. So if you go to the site collection settings, so the site settings here, and let's say you want to create a new result source in Geneva, in the main farm. So let's create a new one. Let's call that test result source acceleration. Yes. It's defined in the site collection, right? So at least it looks like the site collection administrator or owner can define that. But if we go to the DR farm, and we check the result source, there's no result source. Well, the new one is not duplicated because the search is not synchronized between the two farms. And indeed, even if you define at the level of site collection, this result sort end up in the search administration database, which is not synchronized. It's not supported and I will get back to this because it's a real issue. We have solution, but it's an issue in terms of architecture. So now let's switch. So my farm in Geneva is read-only. Now let's say I crash my farm in, my farm in Brussels is read-only. It's as my DR farm. Now if I crash my farm in Geneva, let's go to SQL. And for instance, let's say SQL 1, SQL 2 are crashed, and I need to switch. And switching in DR means you need to do that manually. Of course, we will do that by using PowerShell, but here, just for the demo, I will use a wizard, and some companies use a wizard for that. So you do a failover, you have to do that for the content and for the service. So if I do a failover, so I'll go to the 03 node, and I say, yes, I want to switch to 3 for these availability groups, and you see here, you need to confirm that you might experiment data loss. So the latest transaction might not commit in the worst case scenario. Okay, so here you see this is going on. Okay, and of course you need to do that on the second availability group, so the one for the service databases. Let's switch to server 3 in Brussels. So in the real world it can take up to 1 minute, because here all databases are very small. So now you see now node 03 in Brussels in DR is now the primary node, which means that if I get back to my DR farm, this one, if I refresh, it should not be read-only anymore. It should be read-write. Yes.
And it works.
And it works. It works, yes, DR, yes, it works. You see? Okay, wonderful, right? Yes, I love it. Okay, so let's get back to the slide. So this slide is a slide coming from Microsoft, from the TechNet. It's important, and you notice that the search databases cannot be asynchronously synchronized. So between the main farm and the DR. It's not supported. So the consequence is this. Well, you need to define your search architecture. So one search architecture, that's the one that my current customer has adopted, is 2 farms, 2 search. We have 2 search service applications that crawl in parallel, right? That works. The thing is, two main issues with that. If you define new result source in farm A, you need to define that in farm 2 because it's not synchronized, right? So you can define that by using PowerShell, but you need to run the PowerShell on the 2 farms. That's easy. But the second aspect is a bit more complicated because let's take the analytics. In SharePoint, you have analytics based on the index. So you don't have the same index in the 2 farms. That's 2 different index, right? So you don't have the same analytics. So popularity, for instance, right, that play a role in the ranking is not the same in the 2 farms. So that's an issue. In some case, it's an issue. So if you have search-based application or part of your SharePoint farm which is search-based, and if analytics is really important in the DR, then you have the following solution. So, well, one solution is to back up and restore the search administration database from the main farm to the DR farm, and you have to, of course, to recreate the search service application, and you need to start a full crawl, which can take time. This won't give you the analytics because you do a full crawl, so you lose the analytics, right? But you get the search administration settings, so all the new result source, etc. So you get them in the DR. Or you can regularly do that as well. But the other option, if you want to get analytics, is to make a full backup and a full restore of the whole search service application, and then you get analytics, but it can take a while. So there's no best practice. It's up to you to find a good way based on your business requirement. You see, that's important. Okay, now also something which is, well, I find it very exciting is, let's say you have 2 farms. How can you patch these 2 farms? Actually, the good news is, even if you have a SharePoint 2013 farm, you can patch the 2 farms without having downtime. And how does that work? The logic is the following. First, you patch the DR farm, so the one in Brussels, and then you patch the main farm. But the devil is in detail. Let's go to the DR farm, the one that need to be patched first. You have, as usual, you have to install the new binaries, and you need, because in the DR farm, it's in DR, that means the databases and the content database, but also the service database, are in read-only mode, right? That means if you run psconfig, you might change the database schema, which is impossible because they are read-only. So here you can dismount the content database in DR, okay, that's fine, but you cannot dismount the service application database. So, but they are read-only. So if you run psconfig when they're read-only, again you have an issue. So the idea is remove the service database from the availability group and set this service database in read-only mode in the main farm so that you won't have any content that's going to change in the primary farm in the service database because this database will get synchronized. So that's the only problem here is, well, you cannot change the service for the moment. And then you can run the psconfig on the DR farm. Of course, the schema might change here. You can mount the content database in the DR farm. You can mount them back. And they won't be touched by the psconfig, of course. So, but this is possible in SharePoint because they can run in compatibility range. So they can run with an old format if you want. Okay, and we will change that later. And then you can switch your user to the DR farm and you will patch the main farm. Same process. You install the binaries in the main farm. Your content database are read-only because it's now the DR. So you have to dismount them. And then you can put the service application database back into the availability groups. You start the data movement and automatically your farm 1, the one which is getting patched, will get the patch from the service database in farm 2. It will be upgraded. Then you can run psconfig, you can mount the content database back, so you're still in compatibility range, and you need to upgrade the content database to move away from the compatibility range by using SP upgrade content database. And you don't lose service. Isn't that great?
Wonderful.
We did it. Huh? So that works. Huh? That works. So there's some pitfall for availability groups at the installation and during operation. So when you install the availability groups in SQL Server, make sure that all your nodes use the same file location, exactly the same file location. Also, make sure that all your nodes use the same service account. And in terms of operation, you need to make sure that all the logging need to be synchronized across the nodes. So Isabel showed you how to do that. Just one PowerShell instruction. Also, you need to avoid vMotion. You need to avoid vMotion because we noticed that when a vMotion operation happens, so a VM in VMware is moved to another location, for instance, and then the cluster automatically switch. So availability group and Windows cluster and vMotion, that's not compatible. So make sure that the team in charge of VMware is aware that your cluster VM should not go under vMotion. Okay, because this could be a problem. You want to say something about backup and logs, Isabel?
Yes, but I think we mentioned that before. So yeah. the database is now in full recovery mode. And if you are using availability groups in non-production environment, maybe you are not taking backups. But if you are in full recovery mode and you don't take any backup of the log, after a week or 2 or maybe 3, you will get a full disk. So that's really important.
Yeah, so we need to take transaction look back.
Yes,
that's important.
Yes, that's important.
Okay. Also, something I learned from the ground is sometimes we notice that in different situations, the failover, so we have a switch from one node to the other, so in the synchronous nodes. And this could happen when backup are taken. There are some frozen instruction I see in the SQL Server log, and that can make the cluster switch. Or other operation as well.
It's the same issue than in vMotion, actually.
Yes, it's the same.
It's the same thing. Yeah. Yes.
So what we learn is we adjust the following value, the cluster value. So the threshold. This means that the number of, so the system can miss some number of R beats. So 10 R beats within the same subnet, or 10 between 2 subnets. Okay. So even if you lose up to 10 R beats, the system won't switch automatically. Yes. So adjust that to 10.
You lower the sensitivity.
Yeah? Same for the delay between 2 R beats. Can be adjusted in 2 subnet to 4,000 milliseconds, and in the same subnet to 2,000 milliseconds. So this looks fine. We learn that on the ground.
Maybe I can add that actually the only single point of failure of your architecture will be the network.
Yeah, it could be the network, or it could be the user profile. Because the user profile, if you use user profile sync, for instance, the user profile sync database cannot be synchronized between 2 DR. Okay, so the idea is you need to use the Microsoft Identity Manager in this case. So, and the Identity Manager now support availability groups. That's a news. So since the last byte in March, I think since March, the MIM 2016, which provide you the equivalent of the user profile sync in SharePoint 2016, can use availability groups. I know for sure that HA is supported, but I have to double check if DR, so async, is supported as well. That's something we didn't test in our lab environment. That's something which is on our roadmap. We have a roadmap as well.
For the next iteration.
For the next iteration in a couple of weeks.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yes, also, don't forget that you might have apps and add-ins that might need to be DR aware, and that they need to run in the 2 farms, and if you want this to work, you need these add-ins to use the same authentication realm, both in the main farm and in the DR farm. So we show you how to do that. That's very, very easy. For instance, if you use, I think if you use access service, and this is also mandatory. Yeah, don't forget that in DR. Okay, so we reach conclusion. Oh, so fast already, right? Yeah. As a conclusion, don't forget, and that's important, I know it looks easy, but that's not that easy. Define the SLA with the business. Please make sure, identify the part of your SharePoint farm that need DR, that need HA. That's not easy. Of course, SQL Server Always On Availability Group plays a major role in the HA-DR story. You have secondary nodes. It's easier to set up than the log shipping, the old log shipping. Just one thing, if you want to use Always On Availability Groups in SQL Server, you need, in SharePoint, right, you need the Enterprise edition of SQL Server. So I know that Always On Availability Groups is available in the standard edition of SQL 2016, but I think you have only one database per availability group, which doesn't make sense in SharePoint, right? So you need Enterprise.
It's not fit for that.
So basically, HA is one SharePoint farm with several nodes, data nodes, and of course SharePoint nodes. DR, if you want hot standby, it's two SharePoint farm. Don't overcomplicate your thing, right? So please keep it simple. I'm not saying that you always need two farms. I've never said that. Don't forget the search limitation. So the search is not DR compliant. So don't forget the analytics. Don't forget the search administration. So there are different patterns to solve that. And the TechNet provide you a very good guidance about how to achieve that. Keep the big picture in mind. It's the SharePoint farm, it's the workflow farm, it's the Office Web App farms, it's add-in, and maybe also the Microsoft Identity Manager. Right, so voila. So this was a very quick tour of HA and DR with SharePoint.
You forgot in your conclusion to say that you need to be very, very friendly with the DBA team.
Yeah, you need a lot of patience with the DBA. Be friend with the DBA. So I learned that very early. Yes, indeed.
And listen to them.
Yeah, and listen, yes. And don't be arrogant with the DBA. Yes. Thank you very much. I think we still have time for questions. But beyond that, you can still send us email. So we will answer all the emails. So here are our email address for Isabel. You can even pose a question on Twitter.
Yeah.
That's my email address and my Twitter handle. And don't forget, Acceleration. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you, Serge and Isabel, for this great session. Okay, it's time for question and answers, but we are quite a little bit short with the time now, so I will read you the first question, and other ones are quite long, so I think it will be the best that you answer it via email, if you agree, of course. Okay, so just to remind you again, we will send the recordings of the webinar via email, and the first question is, okay, why do you need to separate the availability groups into content, service, and farm specific? Why not just have them all in one availability group?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So if you have only one farm and you want to manage HA, then yes, you can have one availability group grouping all your SharePoint databases. That's one thing. Now, you might group the database. You might decide to switch. When you switch, you might decide to switch group of database per database. I will illustrate that with the DR. So HA, yes, you can do that with only one availability group. Yes. But if you have HA in the main farm and you have a secondary farm, then you need at least two availability groups. One for the HA, so the database that only need to be synchronized in for the same farm, so in synchronous way. And you need another availability groups that can be set up in async mode. So you need a secondary availability groups if you have a DR. Now, that's the minimum requirement. Now, if you want to patch your farm, we recommend you to create a third availability groups if you have, of course, a main farm and the DR farms, one for the content and one for the services. Why? Because if I show you the slide, just this slide here, where is it? It's this one, yes, here. You see that here, during patching, we have to remove the service database from the availability group. So we do that in one shot. So we ask all the database, only the service database in this availability group to be removed. So it's just a way to organize your stuff. Okay, but you can even avoid that. You can script that and just remove them only from your script, right? So Isabel, want to say something?
Yes, absolutely. Another point, and it is a SQL point of view about having more than one availability groups, is the fact that when you have a lot of database, and that can be the case with SharePoint if you have a lot of content database. It's more for the performance of the failover, it can be really interesting to have several availability groups as well. So
you can switch faster.
Yes, absolutely.
You switch only group by group.
And you can also be strategic, for instance, by organizing the most critical of the big ones in different availability groups. So I will not say sky is the limit, but there are some strategic moves to do that.
Yeah, so requirements, HA, only HA, one farm, two availability groups, HA and DR, two availability groups. Huh? So HA only one, and HA and DR,
at
two.
Least.
That's mandatory, that's at least, right? So, voila. And also, I provide a reference to this in the slide. You get the slide so you can get more details about this. So Marina, yes, for the other question, as you
okay, I think we will leave the other questions for emails, but thank you for the answer, and Steven, I hope you are happy with the answer. Okay, thank you guys for sharing the presentation, and this is also the answer to other questions. We will share the presentations with the recording as well. So I think that's it for today. If you have anything else to add, feel free.
That's it for me. Let's
okay.
On the internet, yes.
Yes.
It would be a pleasure.
Okay. Thank you for everything, and thank you all for joining us today. I hope you liked the sessions and learned something new. Thanks to our presenters, and if you want to try our tools, of course you can visit our website and download a free trial. As I said, if you already don't know, SPDocket is a SharePoint administration tool, and SQL.kit is a SQL Server administration tool. We have some great features, and we also are planning some new great features, so stay tuned for sure. And I think that's all for now. As I said, you will receive your answers to questions via email. And have a nice day, all. Thank you, and bye.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.